The Legend of Zelda and its sequel, The Adventure of Link, were two of the most iconic and popular games of the 1980s, spawning one of the most well-known and revered franchises of all time. As the 90s began, a lot of expectation around the new Super Nintendo and a new Zelda game were in the air. After being originally designed as a third NES game, Zelda Link to the Past was promoted to a high-budget SNES title using a massive 1 megabyte cartridge, compared to most games which only used 512 kilobytes. 2 years after its release, Nintendo took a crack at cramming Zelda down into a mere 300 kilobytes and putting it onto the original Game Boy. Planned as a port of A Link to the Past, Nintendo instead turned it into the first handheld classic in the series, Zelda Link's Awakening. My journey on the road to the Tears of the Kingdom continues as I jump into the SNES and Game Boy titles of The Legend of Zelda. Originally released for the Super Nintendo on the 21st of November 1991, Zelda Link to the Past is one of the most highly regarded titles in the entire series, and it's very easy to see why. The game is an enormous upgrade from the first two titles. A larger, more varied world, a darker and more in-depth story, better combat with the first appearance of the now iconic spin attack, more dungeons with much more character and detail than any of the previous games, more enemy types, more unique items, more detail in the world, more everything. Perhaps most importantly of all though, is the addition of a second map, the Dark World, giving puzzles and the world a fourth dimensional aspect that very few, or as far as I know, no other game had even tried before. It also brought back the vastly preferred top-down gameplay style of the original Zelda, and ditched Zelda 2's side-scrolling elements entirely. I first played Link to the Past around 2006 with the Game Boy Advance release, but I also played the SNES version a few years ago, and then again for this video. For me, this is where the franchise truly becomes incredible. Zelda 1 and 2 are still enjoyable in their own way, but are very much on the hardcore end of Zelda games. And although they hold up well for their age, they definitely show the cracks in their design. Whereas Link to the Past is just undeniably an incredible game, not just for the time in which it released, but even now, nearly 32 years later. It still plays beautifully, with full 8 directional movement, an arc in your sword swing making combat much more enjoyable and approachable, and in a series first, a map. It brought in tons of elements that Zelda games would go on to use in future games, and they are all very much appreciated when you have just played through the first two games without these quality of play improvements. It doesn't feel like you're playing a 30-plus-year-old game like with the NES titles. You could honestly release this today and it would practically feel modern in my opinion, except perhaps in the usage of the controller. One thing Link to the Past could do better is to utilize the controller in which it was designed for. While all of the face buttons are used, the new shoulder buttons are completely omitted from the game for, what I can tell, no reason at all. They could have been used to allow for additional items to be held at the same time, such as in later Zelda games. This would have helped to prevent some of the constant pausing you have to do to change your items, or perhaps to hold your shield up like in pretty much all other 2D games after this one. It seems to be the only odd design choice in the entire game, especially considering how popular the buttons were. Beyond this though, practically every gameplay design decision is nearly flawless to me. Dungeons are fun and interesting to play through with unique rooms and layouts to every inch of them. Multiple floors make dungeons more vertical and grander than in Zelda 1, and they are utilized in a way that makes them feel more connected than they were in Zelda 2. Allowing you to fall between them to get to out-of-reach areas makes the verticality of the dungeons an aspect of the puzzle solving, which is something that the game's sequel, Link Between Worlds for 3DS, would utilize even more over 20 years later. Dungeon items now have a lot more purpose to them, allowing you to solve puzzles and progress further in the dungeon and the overworld, unlike in the previous games where they were pretty much just needed to pass a few obstacles. To top it off, the dungeons now have much more unique and interesting boss battles than ever before, and a unique way to defeat them, using multiple items and strategies to take them down. Everything in Link to the Past is iconic and elevates the franchise by what feels like decades of design improvements. Not just in how you play the game, but in the way it looks and sounds as well. With a charming art style that is still highly regarded to this day, it showcases some of the most incredible pixel art in the history of video games. It sets a dark and memorable tone both in the light and dark world maps, and although the maps are not particularly different in their layout, the color tones and visual changes really make it feel like a completely different world, creating a sense of dread and danger throughout. Then of course, there is the fantastic 16-bit soundtrack. With another iconic overworld theme for both maps, multiple dungeon themes, and dozens of other tracks peppered throughout the game, Koji Kondo once again created one of the best soundtracks in gaming, making new songs that are used in later Zelda games and recreating old ones to sound completely new as well. All of this, and there is still so much more to this game. The story this time is much bigger, with a dark and intriguing tale of a war to reach the Sacred Realm and the Triforce, and Ganon's rise to power over the Dark Realm. Link must traverse Hyrule, claim the Sacred Master Sword, battle through the Dark World saving the 7 Sages, and defeat Ganon. Sounds simple now, but back in the early 90s, this was a lot for a game outside of a turn-based RPG. Top it off with a much more exciting world to explore with hidden items, multiple heart pieces to collect involving mini puzzles to access them, mini-games, secret caves dedicated to competition winners, and even a way to complete the game in about 5 minutes if you know how to glitch through this wall correctly. And of course, who can forget, it brought in the deadliest creature in the series, the dreaded Cuckoo. This game is simply fantastic. From start to finish, it's one of the best games you can play today, and it's stood the test of time for over 30 years. I am sure it will still be highly regarded in 3 more decades. If you haven't already, you need to play this game. Then you need to go play the next game in this video. Just 2 years later, Nintendo did what many thought was simply not possible at the time. They made a handheld Zelda game that could match up to the quality of A Link to the Past, and they practically did it on a calculator. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening released for the original monochrome Game Boy on 6th of June 1993, with a DX version for the Game Boy Color releasing 5 years later in 1998. In my opinion, it is the best Game Boy game you can play. Donkey Kong 94 is definitely a good contestant as well. My first playthrough was with the Game Boy Color DX version. I purchased the original cartridge around 2010 and played it through on a Game Boy Advance SP. Although it hasn't held up to time quite as well as A Link to the Past, it's still a great game to play. It's a very unique start to Zelda's handheld lineage. Set on the island of Koholint, Link washes ashore after a storm and is rescued by a girl named Marin. After waking up, something of a habit for Link to do at the start of Zelda games from this point on, you set off to discover the secrets of the island, meet the islanders, and complete 8 dungeons. So it seems like standard Zelda fare so far, but this time, the story and the characters are a much bigger focus, getting you more attached and familiar with the world than any other in the series so far. This goes on to make the emotional gut punch of the ending much more impactful. As you progress through the game, you come across ancient ruins that reveal that the island and all of its inhabitants are only a dream of the creature sleeping atop its mountain, the Windfish. The only way to leave is to awaken it and destroy the island along with everyone on it but Link and the creature. You collect the 8 instruments from the dungeons, bosses warn and even beg you not to wake the Windfish, but you do, and the whole island vanishes with Link waking up in the ocean after his shipwreck. Whew. Who knew a Game Boy game could give you such a sense of existential dread for completing it? This story is still considered one of the best in the franchise, and is one of the most unique you can find in a game. Writer and designer Yoshiaki Koizumi, the guy who's pretty much the face of Nintendo Direct now, really helped to set a unique tone for the franchise, and would go on to work on other games in the series. He is one of the main reasons this game is so revered in an already highly regarded franchise. One of the key things it does to attach you to its characters is by having Marin be a common appearance throughout the game. Unlike with Zelda in previous titles, and a lot of later ones, Marin is a character you actually spend time with. She's caring to animals and other islanders, she sings a beautiful song that they come to hear from across the map, and she even helps you out at one point in the game to progress. There is also a wonderful cutscene partway through the game that really shows this character's spirit. In Zelda 1 and 2, Zelda is merely a character to save, and in Link to the Past, despite having a bit more presence in the game, is ultimately still just a plot device to give you an end goal. Marin instead shows you how much the world is alive, making you question whether you should wake the Windfish as she wants to leave the island as well, but you know in doing so you would destroy her, the island, and everyone else along with it. She is very well integrated into the story and world, and is much more memorable of a character than Zelda had been up to this point. Moving on from the story is the perfectly translated to handheld gameplay. This doesn't feel like a watered down Zelda game for the Game Boy. Unlike Mario's first outing on the system, which although still fun, was undeniably a downgrade from its console counterparts. Link's Awakening though just feels like a fully fleshed out Zelda game, with side quests, large and varied dungeons, multiple items, dozens of enemies, and lots of secrets to be discovered. If you put this on the SNES with Link to the Past graphical detail, people wouldn't have questioned it. In fact, that's pretty much what happened with the Switch version in 2019, with even better graphics. It even brings some improvements to the gameplay, such as having 2 item slots rather than 1. You can now unequip your sword and use 2 items at once, such as the bow and the bombs to create bomb arrows, or to dash jump with the Pegasus boots and the Roc's feather. It allows you to create some unique combinations that very few other Zelda games have done since. The only downside of this is how often you have to change items, with needing to bring up the pause menu very frequently to swap between them, and not having your sword readily available at all times can be a bit of a pain. Sadly, it's just a limitation of the hardware of the Game Boy only having 2 main buttons. It was also a very weird design choice to make the power bracelet an item you have to equip, rather than just being automatic when you try to pick up an object like in Link to the Past. Beyond this, and obviously the less screen space you would get than on a console version, it actually improves the Zelda gameplay, with a key change for me in making the shield much more useful by allowing you to hold it up to defend yourself, rather than relying on it to automatically work when facing the right direction. This is something all the 2D Zeldas and even the 3D games would use after this. I would also say that Link's Awakening is more difficult than Link to the Past, with no bottles to store fairies in, and more complex puzzles to the dungeons and overworld. I died quite a lot in my playthrough for this video, which was with the Zelda Game & Watch version of the original game, not the DX version. The DX version added some colour, some additional features, and an extra dungeon. Beyond that, it's still the same game. Finally, there's the music and the graphics. Graphics are of course a downgrade from Link to the Past due to the lack of colour and, well, being on a Game Boy, but the designers did a fantastic job of using bold detail to make the environment very distinguishable and memorable. From beaches to mountains, ruins and castles, every area of this game is very unique, and in my opinion has more character to it than in Link to the Past, something that is elevated even more in the Switch remake. It also showed how side-scrolling sections could still be used in a 2D Zelda game, with some areas showing a side-on view that works much smoother than in Zelda 2. There is also a very quirky charm to the game's style, which is elevated even further by using enemies from other Nintendo games as frequent little Easter eggs. Then there is the beautiful music. Honestly, how can a Game Boy produce such memorable and catchy tunes? The title theme, the woods, the overworld theme, the end credits, and of course, the Ballad of the Windfish are all some of my favourite tracks. And there isn't a bad song in the whole game. With somehow a larger soundtrack than Link to the Past, this game has the best soundtrack of any Game Boy game, and is by far one of the most memorable soundtracks of the 90s. Today, if you want to play this classic, definitely go for the Switch remake. It's a beautiful recreation on more modern hardware and is much easier to get hold of. Plus, it has a few modern luxuries to make it easier to play. But if you want to check out the original to get that true classic Zelda experience, then you're not going to be disappointed by this handheld masterpiece, which is one of the best games of all time. That's it for the SNES and the Game Boy generation. It's time to break through to the third dimension as we move on to the 64-bit world of the Nintendo 64 and 2 of the most iconic titles in all of gaming. One is still the highest rated game ever, and the other is probably responsible for many people's nightmares. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Phil, I'm the creator of the Pixel Tavern. I hope you enjoyed this video on 2 of my favourite games and frankly 2 of the best games ever made. If you did, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to be notified of any future videos, including part 3 of this series. Please also leave a comment on your experiences with these games. What system did you first play them on? Where do they sit on your list of favourite Zelda games? Or do you just feel guilty for wiping out a whole island of people? If you'd like to see more of my videos, there are more on screen now. Please go check out my NES generation video for Zelda games. But until the next video everyone, thank you very much for watching.